an 80-year-old moose hunter named William Webster, who lives in eastern Ontario, from the early 1980s when he was hunting up in northern British Columbia. He went onto a little knoll in the forest, and some large rocks were thrown at him from the forest. He said, you know, something's trying to kill me. But then after a little while, the creature walked out, and there it was. Long arms, long shaggy hair, walking upright like a human, but looking much more like a gorilla. He raised his rifle, had the crosshairs on it, said, no, I can't shoot it, you know, it hasn't really hurt me, I'm not a savage. And he just watched it go. And when I heard the story, I asked him, I said, so do you ever think about this again? He said, I think about that every day. My name is John Bendernaugle. I'm a professional wildlife biologist here in British Columbia. We moved out here to the West Coast in 1975, partly so that I could start investigating these Sasquatch reports. I look at this as a wildlife subject, and I'm quite intrigued by it. There have been a number of reports of hunters seeing Sasquatches through telescopic sight or over the open sights of a rifle, raising their rifle, but not being able to pull the trigger. Hunters are not the bloodthirsty people that many people think they are. They have a conscience. They're usually want to make very, very sure about what they're shooting at. And when they see something, a Sasquatch, looking at them with these large eyes, this very human-like face, there's no way they can shoot something like that. Sometimes they say, well, I was afraid I'd be up on a charge of manslaughter. Most often it's just a case of not being able to shoot anything near, that human-like.
My name's Terry Curtin, born and raised in Cumberland, BC, lived in the Comox Valley all my life. Know the hills around here like the back of my hand. And been hunting, fishing, hiking all my life around here. You know, I've shot elk and moose and bears, cougars, the whole works, and none of them looked like this thing. And we were hunting on the back side of the low, and I had a young Kenny Berkeley with me, 14 years old at the time. So I told the young fella to just wait, and I'd go down on the next rock bluff to look over to make sure we're on the right rock bluff to make the turn on the trail. I looked over the rock bluff, and there's a guy standing there leaning against the tree. So I hollered at him, but he didn't answer. And so as I looked at him, he didn't have any rifle or anything with him, and it looked like he had all raggy old rain gear or Stanfields on. You know, I look at it for a bit, and the hair's sticking up on the back of my head. So I turn around, and I said to the kid, I wave him down, and he gets down there, and I said, "Do you see what I see?" He said, "Yep." You know, and you're trying to figure out what it is and where it fits in the scheme of things, and it just doesn't. So we look at it for a couple minutes, I don't know. And then I said, well, we better grab those deer and get out of here because it's going to be dark by the time we get to the truck. So we got back to the cabin, and he went and he drew a picture on a brown paper bag, and I have a copy of it right here, what he drew later for my Christmas present. And so I figured if the kid's seen it and drew a picture of exactly the same thing I seen, there had to be something there.
So memory is really unreliable. You know, we often think we can always trust our memories, but the thing about memory is that it can actually change after the fact. So if a person has seen something which is a little unclear, they see a figure running in the woods, it might be a fox, might be a wolf, might be a bear, then they hear stories about the Sasquatch in that region, and it's very easy for the memory to actually change so it becomes much more Sasquatch-like. And before very long, the person now has a vivid memory of something he or she never really actually saw, but will swear to the end of his or her days that was a Sasquatch.
A few years ago, I started writing a book. I've started pulling reports together and trying to make sense of them, and I found that it actually does add up to a great ape. One of the problems is that it walks habitually on two legs, which is a very human-like characteristic. But except for that and the human-like shape to the foot, most of the characteristics are like a great ape. One of the problems I have with my wildlife biologist colleagues is that they insist that people are misidentifying bears when they report a Sasquatch. And it's true that bears are the only other large hair-covered mammal in North America which occasionally stands up on 2 feet. In fact, the Sasquatch is quite a different creature. It's very, very huge, males being 7 to 8 feet tall, shoulder width being 3 to 4 feet, arms being long, massive chest, sometimes described as being as deep through as it is wide, and of course the hair covering. If this were a bear track, we would see claws out the front. In a soft substrate like wet sand or mud, claws always show. They're non-retractable in bears, and they don't have the big heel. This is very much the human primate sort of situation, the large heel. Bears have a tapering heel. The track would end about here. There would not be long toes like this. There would be round pads for a bear. It's really quite a different track. And the other thing with bears is that they alternate forefoot, hindfoot, and the forefoot is quite different from the hindfoot, where the Sasquatch, being bipedal or walking on 2 feet, is hindfoot, 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 just like we humans. It's always our feet, never our hands in the trackway. As a biologist, I'm always looking for reports of food habits, what the animal has been seen eating or what food items it's been seen carrying. And we now have about 40 items of about 20 of vegetation and 20 of meat, from shellfish right through to deer. There's a report from Vancouver Island that I find really interesting because it involves Sasquatch food habits. And it occurred about 20 years ago on the east coast of Vancouver Island when 2 girls were on the beach on a Saturday morning and heard a slapping sound on the water from around the point. When they came around there, they found themselves face to face with this 7-foot tall, human-shaped creature covered with long, silky, reddish-brown hair, with a stick in one hand and holding ducks in the other. And it looked at them and they looked at it. What's interesting is that one of the girls became a professional artist. So when I was tracking down the story and talked to her, she volunteered to do an eyewitness drawing for me. We don't really know how the stick relates to the Sasquatch catching the ducks. We have a number of reports of Sasquatches brandishing a stick, and that interests me because chimpanzees do that, and of course we humans do that a great deal. And we have the Sasquatch somehow catching those ducks. We really don't know how that happened. It's very curious. There are some reports from clam diggers up the BC coast here that intrigue me very much, because some of the evidence they're reporting sounds very much like Sasquatch activity. Very loud calls in the night, very strong smell on the clam beach, good tracks photographed on the clam beach. One report in particular interests me, and it was on a small island off the north end of Vancouver Island, where a group of clam diggers had pulled their skiff up onto a beach, were walking up the beach. One of them saw a face over a stump, which he described as a gorilla-like face, but said nothing. And then the rocks started coming and the chunks of driftwood started coming, and the clam diggers left very, very quickly. In their words, they think they set a record for getting a skiff dragged off a dry beach and back in the water. But it was very interesting, one talking later about a rock just missing his head, and just the vividness of their encounter with, apparently with the Sasquatch. There's a variety of vocalizations described for the Sasquatch, and usually it's something that cannot be attributed to any known mammal like wolves or elk, or a bird like loons or owls. And as one of my colleagues once said, Sasquatches give themselves away by the sheer volume of their vocalization. Someone once heard one and said, whatever it was, it had the lungs of a horse. Occasionally there's reports from logging crews of loud calls and tracks, and one that comes to mind is from Lockborough Inlet up the BC coast, where tracks were found around the machinery, huge human-shaped tracks around the machinery, and then these loud wailing calls coming from the valley walls for most of the day, and loggers arriving at the beach at night, very wide-eyed from just hearing this so long.
One of the things we have to worry about when we think about things like Sasquatch and so forth is that we have a story, a very interesting story, without any compelling physical evidence. And that's the same sort of thing that we have with flying saucers and so on. The question always is, where's the evidence? Scientists would be delighted to find a Sasquatch or a Loch Ness monster or whatever. All they ask for is reasonable evidence. What they always get is very, very questionable evidence. And the biggest part of the argument for these creatures or these UFOs or whatever is eyewitness testimony. We know eyewitness testimony is very unreliable because people can perceive things that just aren't there, and that's just a part of the way our human perception works.
But the point about these tracks is that they really are physical evidence. They really do indicate that something physical and heavy passed over the land. And if this were in the shape of a bear track, we would then, on the basis of this, record the presence of a bear. And I suggest that these are not, we have enough of these now that we can record the presence of Sasquatches based on tracks like this. Another form of physical evidence that's been described is nests, which people describe as not just vegetation piled up and matted, such as a bear does for a daybed, but actually a rim of vegetation around the outside, branches overarching on the top, something that's really been constructed, because it's another form of actual physical evidence. I guess my goal in studying the Sasquatch and talking about the Sasquatch and writing about the Sasquatch is to raise its validity out of the monster category into the subject of mainstream zoology, wildlife biology, and have it included alongside grizzly bears, moose, deer, and other large mammals of Canada.